From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners from around the world. This is the JAMA Author Interviews podcast, and I'm your host today, Dr. Joseph Ross, Deputy Editor of JAMA and Professor of Medicine and Public Health at Yale. I'm joined today by Dr. Kate Suda, a pharmacist and professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh, and Dr. Mina Tadrous, a pharmacist and assistant professor of pharmacy at the University of Toronto. And we are going to discuss differences in drug shortages in the US and Canada. Katie, let me turn to you first. Tell us about your study and why you did it.
Well, drug shortages are not a new problem for many of us who have practiced clinically. They have occurred for decades. And the need to work on this problem for both of us comes from our experience as pharmacists dealing with this issue daily. However, we've noticed that recently things have gotten worse, with shortages occurring with increasing frequency and lasting longer. We've also observed a shift in the types of medicines in shortage. In the past, drug shortages were primarily medicines administered in hospitals, such as sterile injectables. But now, outpatient medications are also affected by shortages. And the problem is that shortages often seem random, and their causes vary with unanticipated events, such as pandemics, natural disasters, and geopolitical and workforce issues, which disrupt global drug production and drug distribution. While these events occur internationally, they also occur domestically. In the last week alone, 2 unanticipated events have occurred in the United States. The week that we're speaking, there was a longshoreman strike, who are essential personnel to get imported drugs on U.S. soil. Hurricane Helene, which occurred 1 week ago, has led to a closure of a manufacturing plant that produces IV fluids. Our drug supply chain is global, so we wanted to know if different countries are similarly impacted by drug shortages. And Canada is a good comparator to the United States because Canada has similar regulatory standards and manufacturing inspections. And prescription drug coverage is also similar to the US, where half of prescriptions are reimbursed through public sources and half through private sources.
So what did you do? How did you do the study? And please make sure to talk about how you assembled all of this information to do the actual study. Because I remember when I first read this paper being astounded by the work that was involved just to pull together the threads of information on shortage and manufacturing. And so I want to hear more about that too.
So we first linked drug-related supply chain issues, which are reported by 3 different groups between our 2 countries: the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the American Society of Health Systems Pharmacists, and Health Canada. And then we reconciled those 3 systems to national drug purchasing data for each country. And these reports of supply chain issues are the flags that something has happened in the supply chain that may lead to a shortage. We then looked forward to the dates of the supply chain reports to assess if a shortage did occur. And we looked at decreases in monthly units of drug purchases within 12 months of the supply chain issue date. What did we find? We found that from 2017 through 2021, there were 104 drug-related reports of supply chain issues that were common between the United States and Canada. 90% of these reports were for drugs where a generic is available, and 20% of reports were for drugs with a single manufacturer, what we refer to as sole source manufacturing. Now, these results have been previously described and were not that surprising. But we actually went the next step, and we linked these supply chain issue reports to drug purchase data to determine actual national decreases in supply, or a drug shortage. And this is important because while supply chain issue reports are really important because it indicates that our access to these medicines may be at risk, not all supply chain issues will impact the supply available for the patients that we care for. And of those 104 drug supply chain reports that were common between the 2 countries, 49% were associated with drug shortages in the United States, versus 34% of reports of supply chain issues in Canada were associated with national shortages. After we adjust for drug characteristics, reports of supply chain issues were 47% less likely to be associated with drug shortages in Canada compared to the United States.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think there are two major findings. One being just the high rate of shortages after a supply chain report. It's not as if the supply chain reports avoid this shortage, still 30, 40, 50%. But Mina, maybe I can just turn to you to see what was most surprising in your eyes. In part, I expected when I first started reading your paper that shortages would be less likely in the US because the market is larger and you always hear about companies focusing their efforts on ensuring supply there. But you're based up at the University of Toronto. Did you expect that, or tell us more?
Very bluntly, we were surprised that there was a difference between countries, especially in the direction of Canada being less affected by the same drug shortages that occurred. We often hear about the difference in market size, with the US market being the largest in the world and Canada being, although the ninth or 10th largest, depending on how you count it, much smaller. We would hear from manufacturers that they would struggle to get supply into the country, but there was never really this opportunity to compare them. What we had anticipated is that some factors may differ between the drugs and that different markets would affect things within each country, but this was really eye-opening. I think it's important to put this into a little bit of context. The study doesn't answer if one country has less or more shortages. What it does answer is when the same shortage hits both countries, what happens? There's a real good opportunity to think about what's working and what's not, and the fact that there is some sort of opportunity to do things better. And I think there's an opportunity to improve the response or the impact of shortages when they make the same ones. And so I think as a clinician, it makes me feel slightly less hopeless. Some of the things that Canada does, I think, relate to the healthcare system structure. It's easier for Canadians to bring together key players in a single table. So we actually in Canada have these multi-jurisdictional tables that they bring people from across the sector. I think in a smaller country that becomes a little bit easier, but it highlights that this type of coordination when you have a mini crisis is really, really important. Canada has a different structure in its healthcare system, making it easier to bring key players to a single table and navigate each shortage as it emerges. This coordination is a bit more challenging in the US, but also it presents an opportunity in these mini crises to bring all the key stakeholders together. Canada also has a different structure in how we report drug shortages. So we actually have a very prescriptive process where any supply chain issue has to be reported. So the volume of reports is substantially higher, and you see that in our paper, and very different than the smaller amount that we get in the US, which are vetted. We don't know if this is a good or a bad thing. Is there too many false positives? But I think it's an important nuance between the two countries and how they think about it. The last thing that was sort of surprising is that important finding of our work was that some characteristics were not associated with shortages that have been cited in the literature before. So things like formulation, time since drug approval, and drug unit price were not as strongly linked with it as we'd seen in previous literature. This raises some really important questions about how to best think about drugs with the highest risk and gives us pause to think about the dynamic of price and its link with shortages, which is often a very, very hot topic. To us, this flags that pointing to price as a standalone cause for shortages is way too simple to explain all the dynamics that go into it. Rather, our group has started to think about price, along with other factors, as a potential lever for solutions and not the actual cause.
One of the things that I just want to also commend you both on is it's really so important that such high-level groups as yours working together from both the US and Canada to think through these things, because it is a global problem. Katie, you alluded to that. Maybe you could just spend a little bit of time talking about how patients should think about these issues and clinicians, the impact of drug shortages, of supply chain issue reports, and if they see those or if it's part of their thinking in terms of prescribing. I think most clinicians are now familiar with drug shortages, not just because of the pandemic, but because of GLP-1s and tirzepatide. Everyone's talking about shortages because of those drugs. But maybe you could talk about it more generally.
Prescribers are much more familiar with the topic, unfortunately, but note that this is an emergency in the pharmacy. And frequently you think a medicine is coming in your shipment, but it just does not arrive. So there's a lot of things that the pharmacist cannot control for. But the other thing that we want to highlight is the increasing number of outpatient drug shortages and how now the patient must be able to navigate the healthcare system for that patient to get a therapeutic alternative. They've got to contact their prescriber, they have to make more trips to the pharmacy, and that therapeutic alternative may or may not be covered by their formulary, which may lead to increased out-of-pocket costs for the patients that we care for. Also, know that drug shortages have been associated with patient safety events and adverse patient outcomes. We demonstrated this with increase in cardiac events, and other people have shown this with cancer reoccurrences and increased death in critically ill patients with septic shock. Mina, do you want to talk more about the importance of the global supply chain?
One thing that we've also been thinking through, the comparison between two countries highlights that the global supply chain is not an equivalent factor, but factors and shortages do occur in multiple countries at the same time. And so we hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that highlights the need for cooperation and communication between countries. We do see in sort of crisis situations, countries importing drugs from other places. Canada's done this in specific situations when we have had shortages to be able to fill the gap. And I think this is going to be important because you don't want to draw drugs from one country and cause a shortage in another. And so that coordination and those conversations need to be happening at a higher level. And we hope that this kind of conversation, at least in North America, highlights that there's lots of learning that can occur between both countries.
That's all the time we have for today. And I just want to thank you both for making yourselves available to talk about your study in more detail for our listeners. Again, this episode was produced by Shelley Steffens at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks for listening.